Before I get into this, I need to correct the word terrifying in that headline, because nothing about what actually happened threatened anyone here on Earth. But scientists are worried isn't an exaggeration at all. It's exactly precisely what happened, for real, for 5 straight months, to a team of engineers responsible for a 46-year-old spacecraft that suddenly started sending back something nobody could read. This is the real story of the moment Voyager 1's stopped making sense, why a single corroded chip nearly ended the most successful deep space mission in human history, and how a team of engineers, working across a communication delay of nearly a full day, managed to bring it back from the edge. If you want accurate space reporting instead of manufactured horror, subscribe now, because the real version of this story is tense enough without any exaggeration at all. Let's start with what Voyager 1 actually is, because understanding the genuine stakes of this crisis requires understanding exactly what was at risk of being lost. Launched on September 5th, 1977, Voyager 1 became the first human-made object in history to cross into interstellar space back in August of 2012, and it remains to this day the most distant spacecraft humanity has ever built, sitting more than 15 billion miles from Earth by the time this specific crisis unfolded. Every command sent to the spacecraft, and every piece of data sent back, has to travel that entire distance at the speed of light, a one-way trip that, by 2023, already took more than 22 hours to complete. That means every single exchange between engineers on the ground and the spacecraft itself, a command sent, a response received, takes the better part of 2 full days to finish, an agonizingly slow back and forth for troubleshooting anything, let alone a problem nobody could initially even properly diagnose. In November of 2023, Voyager 1's engineering team at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory noticed something had gone genuinely wrong. The spacecraft was still transmitting a signal, a steady, technically functioning radio carrier wave reaching Earth right on schedule, proof the spacecraft itself hadn't gone silent or lost power entirely. But the actual content of that signal, the telemetry data that normally tells engineers everything from the spacecraft's basic operational status to the readings from its remaining scientific instruments, had turned into something unreadable, a repeating pattern that didn't match any known meaningful format. For a team that had been successfully communicating with this exact spacecraft for 46 consecutive years, that was an entirely unprecedented situation. If a story built on real, verified NASA and JPL reporting instead of manufactured horror is the kind of thing you want more of, drop a like on this video right now. It genuinely helps this content reach more people who'd get value out of it. It helps to understand a bit more about the actual computer at the center of this crisis, because the flight data subsystem represents a genuinely remarkable piece of 1970s engineering in its own right. Unlike the powerful, memory-rich computers most people carry in their pockets today, Voyager 1's 3 onboard computers were built using technology considered advanced for their era, but almost unimaginably limited by modern standards, with a combined memory footprint smaller than what a single modern text message might require to store. Every piece of code running on that system had to be written with extraordinary efficiency, since there was simply no room for the kind of redundant, easily patched software modern engineers typically rely on. That extreme efficiency, remarkable as it was, for getting the spacecraft through its original mission decades ago, also meant there was very little built-in flexibility to work with once a genuine hardware fault actually emerged, since the system had never been designed with the expectation that engineers would need to relocate and reorganize its core code nearly 5 decades after launch. It's worth understanding exactly why this specific failure was so genuinely difficult to diagnose, because it wasn't simply a matter of flipping a switch or sending a quick reset command. The garbled data was coming specifically from Voyager 1's flight data subsystem, one of 3 onboard computers responsible for packaging the spacecraft's engineering and science data into a format that could actually be transmitted back to Earth in a way ground controllers could interpret. Something inside that specific system had corrupted the data before it ever got sent, meaning the problem was very likely rooted somewhere in the spacecraft's own aging hardware itself, rather than any kind of transmission error happening along the way. Diagnosing a hardware problem on a computer sitting 15 billion miles away, using nothing but the same garbled, corrupted signal the team was actually trying to understand, represented a genuinely unprecedented engineering challenge, essentially trying to read a doctor's diagnosis written in a language that had scrambled itself somewhere between the doctor's hand and the page. If you found this level of technical difficulty as genuinely tense as I did while researching it, drop a comment and let me know. It genuinely helps me figure out what to cover next. Here's what actually made this crisis so slow and so uniquely stressful for the team involved, because every single step of the diagnostic process had to move at the pace dictated by that enormous communication delay. Engineers would form a specific hypothesis about what might be wrong, based on whatever fragments of information they could actually extract from the garbled data reaching them. They would then carefully write a set of instructions designed to test that specific hypothesis, transmit those instructions toward the spacecraft, and then wait. Just the outbound signal alone took over 22 hours to arrive. Then, assuming the spacecraft actually received and executed the command correctly, another 22 plus hours had to pass before any response, garbled or otherwise, made its way back to Earth. A single round of testing a single idea took a very close to 2 full days to complete, and every one of those exchanges carried a real, acknowledged risk. A single wrong command, sent once to hardware already behaving unpredictably, could potentially cause permanent, irreversible damage, ending the mission for good with absolutely no chance of any kind of physical repair. There is no service call. There is no way to send a technician. Every decision had to be made carefully, deliberately, and correctly, essentially on the first try, with each failed attempt costing nearly 2 more days before the team would even know whether that attempt had worked. Linda Spilker, Voyager's project scientist at JPL, spoke publicly about the genuine gravity of that specific situation, describing it directly as one of the most serious problems the mission had ever faced in its entire remarkably long operational history. A mission that had already, by that point, been operating for well over 4.5 decades. That's a mission scientist with direct, career-long familiarity with this exact spacecraft, describing this specific crisis as standing out in a genuinely negative way, even against the backdrop of everything else the mission had already survived across nearly 5 decades of continuous operation. If you found Spilker's own assessment of the situation as sobering as I did, drop a comment and let me know. It genuinely helps me figure out what to cover next. There's a genuinely significant human dimension to this crisis worth understanding too, one that goes beyond the pure technical challenge of the failure itself. Many of the original engineers who designed and built Voyager 1's onboard systems back in the 1970s have long since retired, and some have passed away in the decades since launch, meaning the current generation of JPL engineers responsible for actually solving this specific crisis had to work primarily from decades-old documentation, programming languages, and design philosophies that predate essentially their entire careers. That knowledge gap represents one of the quieter, less dramatic, but genuinely serious challenges facing the Voyager mission as it continues aging. An irreplaceable body of institutional knowledge that's had to be carefully preserved, documented, and passed down to newer engineers specifically because there's no way to simply call up the original designers for a consultation anymore. Successfully solving the 2023 crisis required this newer generation of engineers to essentially teach themselves how to think like the specific team that built this hardware nearly 50 years earlier, working through original technical specifications and schematics to understand precisely how the flight data subsystem's memory was structured before they could even begin proposing a safe, workable relocation plan for the affected code. Over the following months, engineers slowly, methodically worked through the problem and eventually traced the source of the corruption down to something remarkably small and specific, a single chip within the flight data subsystem's memory that had apparently stopped working correctly, most likely after decades of continuous exposure to the harsh radiation environment of deep space. The same kind of high-energy cosmic radiation that had been steadily bombarding every piece of the spacecraft's electronics since the moment it left Earth's own protective magnetic field, back in 1977. That chip was responsible for storing a portion of the flight data subsystem's own software code, and once it failed, that code, and the important data meant to be packaged around it, came out scrambled every time the system tried to actually use it. Here's where the genuine engineering ingenuity of this story actually comes in, because the team couldn't simply replace the broken chip, obviously, given that it was sitting on a spacecraft 15 billion miles away with absolutely no way to physically access it. Instead, engineers devised a workaround that involved relocating the affected code to different parts of the flight data subsystem's remaining, still functional memory, splitting it into smaller pieces, and storing those pieces in whatever working memory space was actually still available, then carefully reprogramming the various parts of the system to correctly find and use that relocated code from its new location. It's worth appreciating just how delicate that specific task actually was. Engineers were essentially performing a kind of remote surgery on a computer's own internal memory, using nothing but a communication link with a nearly 2-day round-trip delay, working with detailed technical specifications, and code written by an entirely different generation of engineers back in the 1970s, many of whom were no longer available to consult directly. The team tested their proposed fix incrementally and carefully, moving one small piece of relocated code at a time, verifying each individual step actually worked correctly before attempting the next one, a process that inherently required patience, given the communication delay involved, since even confirming that a single successful step had genuinely worked required waiting through that same lengthy round trip before the confirmation could arrive. By April of 2024, roughly 5 months after the crisis first began, the team's careful, methodical approach finally paid off. Voyager 1 resumed sending back clear, readable engineering data, confirming the spacecraft's core systems were healthy and functioning correctly. By the following month, the spacecraft had also resumed returning usable science data from its remaining operational instruments, restoring the mission to full, genuine operational capability after 5 months of uncertainty about whether that would even be possible at all. It's worth drawing a clear distinction between this 2023 crisis and the separate, more recent power challenges Voyager 1 has faced since, because conflating the two would blur what actually makes each one distinct. The 2023 data corruption crisis was fundamentally a hardware failure problem, a specific physical component breaking down after decades of radiation exposure, requiring engineers to work around damaged circuitry through creative software solutions. The 2026 power challenges, by contrast, stem from something entirely different and considerably more predictable: the slow, steady, mathematically certain decline of the spacecraft's plutonium-powered generators, losing roughly 4 watts of available electricity every single year, with absolutely no way to reverse or replenish that decline. Both categories of problem are genuinely serious, and both have required real, careful engineering work to address, but they represent two fundamentally different kinds of threats to the mission's continued survival. One, a sudden specific hardware fault that could theoretically strike any single component at any time without warning. The other, a slow, entirely predictable countdown that engineers can plan for and manage, but never actually stop. That distinction matters, for understanding the full picture of what keeping Voyager 1 alive actually requires at this point in its extraordinarily long life. It's not simply a matter of carefully rationing a shrinking power supply, the kind of problem covered in earlier discussions of the spacecraft's ongoing 2026 challenges. It's also a matter of hoping that no other critical piece of 49-year-old hardware fails unexpectedly, the way the Flight Data Subsystems memory chip did back in 2023, since there's no way to predict in advance exactly which specific component might be the next one to give out, or exactly how difficult that next failure might prove to diagnose and work around from 15 billion miles away. It's worth being honest about what genuinely would have been lost if this specific crisis had ended differently, because sitting with that possibility helps explain exactly why the team treated it with such seriousness. Had the Flight Data Subsystem never been successfully repaired, Voyager 1 would likely have continued transmitting nothing but that same unreadable carrier signal indefinitely, technically alive, but functionally useless for any further scientific purpose. Its unique, irreplaceable position in interstellar space rendered scientifically silent. That would have meant losing access to one of only 2 functioning instruments still capable of directly sampling conditions in true interstellar space, permanently ending the specific line of research into the persistent plasma emissions and magnetic field measurements. This exact spacecraft has continued providing in the years since this crisis was actually resolved. No replacement mission currently exists, and none is realistically expected to arrive at a comparable position in interstellar space for at least another 2.5 decades, meaning a permanent loss back in 2023 or 2024 would have created a genuine multi-decade gap in humanity's only direct, real-time window into that part of the universe. It's worth understanding how this crisis actually unfolded in public view, too, because it wasn't a story NASA kept quiet while working through it internally. JPL issued regular public updates throughout the 5-month troubleshooting process, describing each incremental step as the team worked through their diagnosis and eventual fix, a level of transparency that gave outside observers, journalists, and space enthusiasts around the world a genuine real-time window into just how uncertain the outcome actually remained for months at a time. That kind of open, honest communication about a genuinely uncertain situation reflects something worth appreciating about how NASA generally chooses to handle these kinds of aging spacecraft crises, resisting the temptation to either downplay the severity of the problem or wait until a resolution was already guaranteed before saying anything publicly at all. People following the story in real time had no more certainty about the eventual outcome than the engineers themselves did. An honest, if genuinely tense, way to share a story still very much in progress. It's worth reflecting on what this specific crisis actually reveals about the underlying character of the entire Voyager mission, because it's a genuinely remarkable illustration of just how much resilience was built into hardware designed nearly 5 decades ago, using technology that predates the personal computer, the cell phone, and the internet as most people understand it today. Engineers in the 1970s couldn't have specifically anticipated the exact failure that occurred in 2023, but they built a system flexible enough and left behind documentation thorough enough that a completely different generation of engineers, working decades later, was able to diagnose an entirely novel hardware failure and devise a genuinely creative workaround, all without ever being able to physically touch or directly examine the actual broken component responsible. That resilience matters considerably beyond this single crisis, too, because Voyager 1's engineering team has continued facing new, similarly serious challenges in the years since this specific incident resolved. In February of 2026, the spacecraft experienced an unexpected power drop during a routine maneuver, coming dangerously close to triggering an automatic safety shutdown, ultimately requiring engineers to permanently retire one of the spacecraft's remaining scientific instruments that April specifically to keep the underlying spacecraft itself safely operational. Each of these incidents, the 2023 data corruption crisis included, reflects the same fundamental reality underlying this entire mission at this point in its extraordinarily long life. Voyager 1 is operating nearly 5 decades past its original design lifespan, using irreplaceable hardware that simply cannot be physically repaired, and every new problem the team encounters carries the genuine possibility of being the one that finally, permanently ends the mission for good. It's worth being honest about that underlying reality directly, rather than either exaggerating it into manufactured horror or downplaying it into false reassurance. The 2023 crisis genuinely could have ended Voyager 1's mission permanently. The team itself has said so plainly, but it didn't, because a group of engineers, many of them considerably younger than the spacecraft they were working to save, applied extraordinary patience, careful incremental testing, and genuine technical creativity to a problem that had no precedent and no established playbook to follow. Working across a communication delay that turned even simple troubleshooting into a months-long endeavor, that's not a manufactured, sensationalized scare story. It's a genuine, well-documented example of exactly how difficult and exactly how rewarding it can be to keep humanity's most distant active spacecraft alive and talking, one careful, deliberate step at a time. So, what does all of this actually add up to? In November of 2023, Voyager 1 began transmitting garbled, unreadable data after a single memory chip failed somewhere within its flight data subsystem. A genuine crisis that NASA's own project scientists described as one of the most serious problems the mission had ever faced across its entire remarkably long history. Over 5 months of careful, methodical troubleshooting, conducted entirely across a communication delay stretching nearly 2 full days for every single exchange, engineers at JPL diagnosed the failure and devised a genuinely creative workaround, relocating the affected code to different sections of the spacecraft's remaining working memory, ultimately restoring full engineering and science data by the spring of 2024. There's a specific reason this story deserves to be told accurately rather than dressed up with manufactured horror, and it comes down to what actually made those 5 months genuinely gripping in the first place. It wasn't danger, it was uncertainty, patience, and genuine human ingenuity applied to a problem with no established playbook, unfolding at a pace dictated entirely by the sheer physical distance separating Earth from its own most far-flung creation. That's a considerably more interesting story than any exaggerated headline could ever capture. And it's exactly the kind of story real space exploration keeps producing, whether or not anyone happens to be watching closely enough to notice when it happens. If stories like this, the accurate version rather than manufactured horror, are what you come here for, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because Voyager 1 is still out there, still facing new challenges every year, and there's a very real chance the next crisis tests this same team's ingenuity all over again. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.